Rated T for teen.
Hello and welcome to GAIA Cast, a spoiler-filled deep dive podcast into the world of Horizon from the team here at Guerrilla. We're looking forward to diving into the lore, hearing some behind-the-scenes anecdotes, and maybe even learning some new things. Our first series of episodes will be focusing on Horizon Zero Dawn, the first installment of the Horizon series, which we launched in 2017. I'm Chante, and I'm joined by my co-host, Anna. Hey, Anna.
Hi, Chante. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Me too.
We're also joined by two devs, one we've been lucky enough to have on for multiple episodes now. Please introduce yourselves.
Hey, I'm Ben McCaw. I'm the narrative director here at Guerrilla, and on Zero Dawn, I was the lead writer.
And I'm Tim Stobo. I'm the lead quest designer on Forbidden West, and on Zero Dawn, I was a senior quest designer.
This episode, we're exploring the Carja Civil War, an event in the world of Horizon that saw tremendous loss and created massive rifts between various tribes. I'm interested in learning more about this, so let's just jump in. So, what was the world of Horizon like before Sun King Jiran's reign?
I think it was a really different world, and the primary reason was because the machines were docile, or mostly docile. So all the machines that you see in the world of Horizon have various states of kind of hostility towards Aloy or to other humans. But back then, 20 years before the game started, they were primarily docile and would only really bother you if you bothered them. And so it was a very different and more peaceful world. And I think the Carja were not necessarily peaceful. They were a big empire, an imperialistic empire, but they weren't nearly as bloodthirsty as they became later. And I think also, if it hadn't been for what we call the derangement, which is where the machines stopped being docile, became more hostile, maybe Sun King Jiran would have been just another kind of selfish, egotistical leader, but not the kind of complete monster that he became later.
And the Carja Civil War focuses a lot on Mad Sun King Jiran and his son Avad, who we meet in Horizon Zero Dawn. Can you tell us a bit more about these characters and how they were developed?
Sure. I mean, I think what we really needed in terms of the game more than anything was a situation that Aloy could come into where she could have a big impact on the state of the Carja. And so that's where I think the core idea of the Civil War is, which is basically two halves of a tribe that are sort of poised on the brink of maybe something much worse, but maybe something better if someone can kind of come along and make a big change. And that's sort of what Aloy does. And Avad represents the sort of positive part of that change. He's someone who's really trying to make the tribe a better place. And he's kind of a progressive leader in that respect. But his father, the Mad Sun King Jiran, was the opposite of that. Someone who really furthered his own ends and his own power through a kind of bloodlust. So, we wanted the tribe to be at a kind of tipping point. And that was really the inspiration, and those two characters kind of represent both sides of it.
So you just mentioned it already a little bit, like what is the Carja Civil War and when it started?
Yeah, so we have this event called the Derangement, and the Carja tribe, led by the Mad King Jiran, they start casting that kind of hostility of the machines as a spiritual problem that can only be solved by appeasing the sun god through human sacrifice. And so eventually what they do is they start raiding other tribes in order to get those sacrificial victims. And this escalates until they are essentially at war with multiple tribes. And then eventually Jiran is overthrown by his own son, Avad, and a coalition of Asuram. We call them freebooters. They're sort of like friendly mercenaries. And they manage to force him from power in an event we call the Liberation of Meridian. Once that happens, though, certain elements of the regime flee west and kind of keep to the more violent ways, and we call them the Shadow Carja. So the Civil War refers to that split. So there's the Liberation, where the kind of more progressive Carja stay in Meridian, but a group of more traditional, reactionary, hostile ones go to Sunfall in the west, led by Helis, who's kind of Aloy's nemesis, and rallied around a child king, Edaman, who's actually Avad's half-brother.
And Tim, during development, yourself and the team on Quest, they don't necessarily have an eye on the Horizon backstory like we were just discussing. What is that like? And how does the perception of different characters change as you learn more about like their backstory?
Sure. I think in some respects, it makes development for us really interesting because when writing gives us, the data logs or the conversations, suddenly we learn more about the story, and that's really exciting. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know this happened. So that's kind of cool. But then it's also like the first time I read a quest with Erend, I did not perceive him as the character he ended up being. I had no idea he was going to turn into this like fan favorite kind of kooky drunk guy.
And how did the quest and narrative team work together on these kind of quests?
So there's sort of two different ways we work with the narrative team. So when we all started on Zero Dawn, the narrative team already had the main story and a lot of the tribe documents written out.
Yeah.
And we would just was like a page summary of what would take place in each main quest. And every designer would take that and they would start building that main quest. And in a lot of cases, you wouldn't learn what was going on in the other main quests until they were finished or at least playable. But with the side quests, it was a lot more back and forth. So Ben had already gotten a lot of the tribe documents, like I said, and he could share those with us. And then we would have meetings where kind of all the quest designers and all the writers would get in a room and we would just start pitching ideas at each other.
Yeah.
And sometimes those caught on and you would get a quest really quickly. And other times it took us, months to go from what we thought was this really cool idea to something that made it into the game, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a really momentous time for Guerrilla because we were shifting from making first-person shooters into this vast open-world game. Yeah. And we had to figure out all these new ways of working together and new processes to kind of figure that out. And from the writing side, I think a key thing that we did in collaboration with the Quest team was to create, I think Tim was alluding to it a second ago, this document called the narrative summary for each quest. And that was kind of a bare bones treatment of the narrative, which was still in many places like very much work in progress, that the quest designers could go and then like start not only building the quest, but also coming up with some like key gameplay beats. Things that like writers, that's not really, their best function to provide, where as the quest designers could envision how to turn something into a cool space or how to envision to turn something into a cool combat encounter.
Yep. Also, which quest in Horizon Zero Dawn featured this Carja Civil War?
I mean, there's a bunch, right?
Yeah, there's a lot that allude to it, but I think in fictional terms, it's actually a ceasefire during the events of the game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you see, for instance, the events that led up to the Civil War play out in the two quests that involve Uthid and Vanasha a lot. And there's also a number of side quests, including robbing the rich and Sun and Shadow, where you really see the like after effects of it.
Yeah.
But what Tim was just talking about in terms of the ceasefire is that idea of the tipping point, that Aloy can kind of come in and sort of turn this in a new direction because things are in a kind of precarious balance.
And do you have a favorite backstory element or quest moment that you think maybe fans actually don't know about?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot to go through. I think for me, my favorite Civil War quest is probably Sun and Shadow because it is, I guess it feels a little bit different, like these young lovers that are separated by the war. It feels, I guess, a little bit more everyday than some of the other quests. It still ends up being a matter of life or death, but it's kind of nice to have a different story in there. I really like that one.
Yeah.
Take a different angle on this. I do. He actually stole one of my favorites. But a different angle on this is actually about a character that I think a lot of people like, which is Nil. And if you really pay attention to what's going on with Nil in those raids on bandit camps, his story kind of is interwoven with the Carja Civil War and the Red Raids quite a lot. And he has a very, of course, unique and kind of homicidal insight into all that stuff. So, I mean, that's something that I really enjoyed, because if you kind of trace Nil's path through the game, a lot of it does, in fact, involve events surrounding the Civil War.
So let's talk about the key quests that we experience while learning more about the Civil War. The sacrificial rite of the Sun Ring is central to the story of the Red Raids and the Carja Civil War. Aloy experiences it herself in the Terror of the Sun main quest. Could you tell us a bit more about how that quest came to be, and does it reflect the use of the Sun Ring in a broader fictional sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. So, like, central to the idea of the Red Raids and the Carja Civil War is the idea that these human sacrifices were thrown into a combat ring with machines, and they would very frequently not be given much to fight them with. So it was a certain death, and a horrible death, in a spectacle. And we imagine that there were actually multiple sun rings. There's clearly one in Meridian, there's one in Sunfall, and there's probably others throughout the Carja Sundom. And we really wanted Aloy to experience this in some way, right? Because it's such a vivid, violent thing. And we also needed that kind of story moment where all is lost, right? Where, like, she's thrown in the Sun Ring, she doesn't have her focus anymore. Helis seems to have completely triumphed. She doesn't have her stuff. And she's also told that the Nora are about to be wiped out by the eclipse.
Yeah.
So it's this, we needed that moment. And I think we worked really hard with the quest team to kind of bring it to some kind of cool fruition.
Yeah, I think so. This is an interesting one for quest because it's this great story moment, right? Like, Aloy loses her focus, she loses all her equipment, and then you give it to quest and it's like, all the things that make fighting robots possible, we've removed them. So Elroy was the designer on that quest. He got the not so enviable task of figuring out, how do you fight a machine if you can't learn its weaknesses, if you can't shoot anything at it? I think we did a lot of testing before we finally got the machine charging working. It just sort of felt, I can't remember the word, but it felt like it makes sense to get the cargo rhino to charge at you and you dodge out of the way. And then having that bring down the thing in the middle of the Sun Ring so that you can get your weapons back, that solves one of the other problems. And then you just have, this is a machine you've potentially never seen before that you're fighting for the first time. So we had to do a lot of work with play testing, just seeing how people learned how to fight the machine, seeing if we could add call-outs sort of hinting at what players had to do. And it worked out. It's a really cool fight, but it was one of those moments where narrative just throws a curveball at us and we figure out how to make it work.
That's what we do. But I think also it did turn out really well. And it has a highly cinematic feel. It feels like, it's like from an epic movie where you have this kind of audience jeering you while this machine charges at you. So I think it was really successful, and it did all the story things we needed it to do. And I think it actually felt relatively credible too when Aloy got her stuff back and was able to kind of fully take it on.
Yeah, and as you're playing through side quests like Traitor's Bounty and Queen's Gambit, we go deep into the Shadow Carja territories. How did you translate all that palace intrigue and into action for these quests?
That's an interesting one. The palace intrigue that starts that was always part of the main quest line. So you always have to go into that palace scene, and we always knew that was going to happen, but then trying to figure out how the quest branches off from that was a different task, I think. And the first one of those, the Trader's Bounty, is one that came online quite late, but I think it works really nicely because it's when we'd learned more about what made the gameplay of Horizon work, and we were a little bit more hands-off. We weren't quite as worried that players wouldn't know what to do. So we have that moment where we just tell people, we'll go find the 3 rotten trees or the 3 dead trees. And from there's this cool moment of tracking and slowly learning more about Uthid, who's a character you haven't met, but you have to feel like you're on his side. And that worked really nicely. And then it's also one of the few places in the game where you get, I think there's Banuk mercenaries. There were originally Utaru mercenaries as well, but I think we cut them because they're still in the quest, but you don't fight them. They get killed off screen because the quest was just getting so big.
Yeah.
But it feels like this really cool setup where you're learning about a character and you're totally on his side by the time it counts.
Yep.
So that was a lot of fun to build. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of felt like, we wanted to give a lot of action to the Uthid character and have Aloy sort of meet him and have to fight with him. But we also had all of this like off-screen storytelling that we had to do. So it's really interesting how it worked out, because on one level, you're kind of learning this whole story of how Uthid uncovered some really awful things that his superiors were doing. I mean, they're essentially like poisoning the sick and old so that the others will have enough rations in Sunfall. And so you're kind of learning all about that, but you also needed to have this like big action beat. And I think that action beat turned out to be something that, I really enjoyed in the game when I finally kind of got down to playing it, because you get some really cool moments where you're meeting up with Uthid and he kind of like has a arrow in his bow ready to shoot you because he doesn't know what's coming at him.
Yeah.
And you go from that point to like helping him defeat kind of like his arch enemy, who's this evil priest. And there's also some just really cool moments there where we, like Tim was talking about, where we set up the mercenaries and then you kind of get to fight them. So that was fun.
And the Shadow Carja civilians, they have it pretty rough, as you can tell from side quests, Healer's Oath and Robbing the Rich, of course. How were these quests written to show us like exactly what it was like to live there and what it was like to live under Shadow Carja rule?
Well, I think what we wanted to do with those quests was make sure we sort of showed the good, the bad, and the ugly of what was going on with the Shadow Carja.
Yeah.
So the good, in the sense that one thing you actually learn is that there are Carja, this is in the Robbing the Rich quest, but there are Carja that are trying to help the Shadow Carja. They're trying to smuggle in food and other supplies. And one of the things that's important, like any civil war, it's like families have been torn apart, right? Like it's one tribe that's been kind of cut in two, and some family members wound up on each side. So there's really good people trying to help out the refugees, and the refugees themselves are primarily good. They're just trying to survive. Then there's the bad, where you have basically thugs and enforcers that you have to fight. They're soldiers, but they're also, we kind of depict them as soldiers that maybe like their jobs a little too much. And finally, the ugly, in that, you kind of meet like this profiteer, Galiv, this is in Healer's Oath, but he's like a doctor who isn't exactly following his oath. I mean, he's someone who's really much more interested in getting a Thunderjaw heart. But one thing I remember about that quest, and what was kind of really interesting about that quest, is like, if you just look at that quest, it's just this awesome combat moment, right? Like if you kind of strip out the story, it's like it's about fighting the Thunderjaw.
Yeah.
But then we were able to kind of weave in this really kind of interesting, malevolent character,
And you were just talking about kind of weaving in the story. How does the team work on balancing all the information that we learn in the data points and that we learn in conversation to build this grand story?
Well, I mean, one thing about the data points is they're kind of an infinite resource. Like you can have, I don't know, as many as you want. Like Tim's team and other teams have to place them, and make them work. But we had data points that have just huge amounts of backstory in one data point. One good example is there's a data point that just goes through all the different Sun Kings that ever were, and there's another one that describes the liberation. But a conversation has to push the main action forward as quickly as possible. So even if you look at the conversations that you have with Erend in the City of the Sun quest and the Field of the Fallen quest, there's quite a lot of back and forth, but there's also a way to cut through those conversations as quickly as possible to get to the action for players that want to do that. So I think that's really the difference. Data points, you can kind of have as much or as little story as you want, but the conversations always have to have the critical path to kind of drive the quest forward all the time.
Yeah. I think it's interesting as well, because the two quests we just touched on, the Robbing the Rich and the Healer's Oath, they didn't come about out of some desire to fill out the story necessarily. Robbing the Rich, we originally wanted it to be, it was like a secret society quest with like hidden signs around Meridian. And I think it was going to be like Shadow Carja infiltrators or something, right? And it was only after it was reversed that suddenly that all fell into place. And then the Healer's Oath, we got to the end of development and realized we had no quests, I think, in that part of the map near the Shadow Carja Citadel. And we were like, hey, fighting machines is pretty fun. What if we just put a Thunderjaw there? And then that's the great thing, is that this is kind of the opposite way to the main quest work. This is quests saying, hey, we've got this gameplay. What can you do with it? And writing delivers these amazing stories around it.
But I think like I remember now the hidden signs thing, and we tried several iterations of that. We couldn't kind of get it to work. But what you did wind up with, thanks to your team, is this kind of almost like take down a bandit camp experience. Although it's not bandits, it's the Shadow Carja themselves, where you really get to kind of infiltrate this actually heavily guarded camp. And I also remember there's some for fans that want to dig deep. There's some pretty fun like ambient dialogue in that camp.
I played this yesterday. It's hilarious. Yeah.
So while you're playing through the main quest to Curse the Darkness, it shows the main base of the Eclipse, but it also gives a lot of insight into the Carja Civil War. How does the team create quests that also weave in a lot of these backstories, and how do we plan everything out that you want to share in advance?
The thing about that quest, I mean, it turned out great. It was a bit of a tough one, but if you think about the real backstory elements in the quest, it's all in one spot. It's basically we have this moment where you can go into Helis's tent. And it's like, I think we crammed like 5 or 6 data points into that spot.
Yes. Yeah.
But it is pretty cool because this is like a moment where you really get this perspective on Helis that you would not get otherwise, about his deceased wife, about his relationship to Jiran, about his relationship to Edaman, and also just what a loathsome human being he is in general. But what's interesting about that quest, if you kind of think about it, there's all kinds of story things going on, all kinds of action, but the backstory elements are all just crammed into this one location around which you guys built like a really awesome adventure.
Yeah, and it's also, you talk about how that was planned, and it kind of wasn't. That quest used to be in a completely different place with a completely different sort of, I don't know if the story was different, but it was originally under the Sun Ring. And it was sort of started the same way that you start Deep Secrets of the Earth. You go to the bounty for Uthid, and you end up sort of jumping into a bunker underneath the Sun Ring. Mm-hmm. And I built this place, and I don't actually remember what it was for, except that it was full of Eclipse and Shadow Carja, and I think it sort of made the link between those two. And then at some point, Matthias, the game director, realized that we had the Grave Horde, which was a bunker on one side of the map. And then we had, we called it MQ11 at the time. It didn't have a name. And that was a bunker. And then you had Deep Secrets of the Earth, and that was a bunker. And then you had the Terror of the Sun, and that was you locked into a single space. And we're meant to be making this, wide-reaching open world game. Yeah. And he's sort of like, well, maybe we need to break that up a little bit. And that's when To Curse the Darkness was sort of repositioned and reimagined. And I think the only thing that survives, this is my little contribution to Horizon, as small as it gets. Because it was meant to be an old military bunker, I was doing research and trying to find props, things that I could fill a military bunker with. And I came up with just looking at aircraft carriers and stuff, there was sort of missile tubes that you put on jets, and they were all stacked in a pallet. So there's a big cube of circles. And I built that with designer art, looked amazing. And some artist made it, and it is in the game. Yeah, I'm like, yes.
But I do remember, I think that at some point we had the desire to kind of have all the bad guys in one place. So you had like Sunfall, and underneath it would be like the base of the Eclipse. I think that was like the core concept. But I think it works so much better in the version that it is now for all the reasons that you and Matthijs, kind of were talking about, just simply because we got it outdoors. It feels like it's a different part of the open world, but also you get this sense from it that the Eclipse have this really specific base. It's in a place that really makes sense because it's all centered around the Horus, where the giant robot where Hades is kind of living at the time, is like his little apartment. And also you get this great kind of adventure with the Tallneck where Aloy kind of has to crash this network. So I feel, and also what I also really like about it spatially is just that like you kind of know then later that's where the Eclipse are coming from at the very end of the game when they attack Meridian. So it also sort of spatially sets that up in the world in a cool way.
How does the team decide which of these quests like really makes a player go deep into like the backstories of the world of Horizon?
I think it's actually, I was thinking about this, and it's like, it's simple in a way, which is that the main quests kind of all need some of that. Every single main quest should have you reach into the backstory a little bit, so you're continually building the world on the critical path. But the side quests can do the deeper dive. I mean, that's really, so like the main quest has kind of a lot of work to do and a lot of adventures that have to happen, but the side quest can dig deeper into a specific cultural element or backstory element or gameplay element, of course. That's like the hope. And I mean, Sun and Shadow being like a perfect example.
Yeah, no, that one, that was a pitch I had. It is literally Romeo and Juliet, so it was an easy one to come up with. I didn't have to do a lot of work. But I think a lot of the pitches come from the designer's desire to learn more about this stuff as well. It's like, well, if there was a young couple separated by the Civil War, what would happen? What would that mean? And that's where I have a lot of fun, just sitting with the writers and saying, well, if this, then what? And how do we make that? That's a lot of fun to do.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the side quests, Sun and Shadow, and also Honor the Fallen, they both show us the suffering inflicted from the Red Raids and the Carja Civil War. These are quite heavy topics to navigate and experience while you're learning more about the world. From a design and a narrative standpoint, what did the team want to achieve with these quests?
I think we have different goals, because Honor the Fallen, it was always sort of it's one of the few quests that was imagined as you going around and sort of rekindling these monuments to people who died in it's not the Civil War, it's to the Red Raids and to the South before that. But at first it was like you were literally relighting fires, or you were just going to a place, fighting machines, and then that's you light the part of the quest that you need to do and you move on to the next location. And there were a lot of iterations before it turned into what I think is a much more poetic quest than just go here, do the thing, go somewhere else, do the thing. And I think it's sort of, once we figured out what the gameplay was, having narrative come in and sort of work over the top of that is really valuable.
Yeah, that one was one where at some point we were able to reimagine that as like helping these three victims. And I think it's basically the Red Raids, is my recollection. There's a Banuk, an Utaru, and an Oseram. And what I really like about the quest is the three stories are combined in a particular way, about it being about grief and about honoring someone who's passed on, but that the gameplay is really diverse. So it's like the Banuk version is like a climb, and the Utaru one has a fight, and the one with the Oseram is actually purely dialogue, or almost purely dialogue. So you get different flavors, but the underlying theme is just about how the Civil War and the events that preceded it really destroyed the lives of a lot of people. And the way you kind of get to help them a little bit and to kind of like light that candle for each of the fallen is it sort of still sticks with me.
And do you have a favorite character that we meet as we're uncovering more about the Shadow Carja and the Eclipse? I'm Vanasha all the way.
I've got lots of favorites, but I mean, two of them that really stand out for me, and we were just talking about both of these quests. So in Healer's Oath, you have this Dr. Galiv, who's just really just a very eloquent jerk. And he's really he's a profiteer who try to masks everything in a kind of cynicism. I really like that. And then another one I really like, who's a little bit similar, is the priest that you meet in Honor the Fallen. This is just a perfect example of someone who's so steeped in tradition and so steeped in their own self-importance that they literally can't move on. And Aloy really gets to kind of dress him down. I mean, really kind of reduces this guy to, verbally reduces him to just kind of, it's a humiliation that he sort of richly deserves. And I think those two things were really kind of stood out for me.
I think, I'm going to get his name wrong, but I think his name is Three-Toed Huadiv.
Yeah.
He's unexpected. He just is such a scummy, weak character, but he also got wrecked by a rock breaker, so I kind of allow it. And then for me, I mean, Vanasha is amazing, but I think it's a tough split between like her and Uthid. They're a good combo, I think.
I think also just those two, they have really great chemistry, and both of the actors did a great job. And Uthid just has that great voice as well. So that was one of those things where the voice acting just took it to a different level.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Liberation, which is of course linked to the Carja Civil War. What was it and how was it developed?
So the Liberation is the moment in our backstory where the Mad Sun King is overthrown by his own son, Avad. And it sets up the kingdom of the Carja, the Sundom, as a place that can be a little more sympathetic for Aloy. Because if she were to enter the Carja at a time prior to that, or in a way where they were sort of more hostile, it would never be a situation where she'd want to help them. So we knew we kind of needed to kind of have the war be not over, but kind of simmering. And we didn't want her to deal with the sort of evil side of the Carja as much, at least not at first.
Yeah.
And I think for people that are interested and really want to dig into the details of it, it's the subject matter of our comic book right now, that we're doing with Titan. So it's a 4-issue arc that kind of goes through the events of the Liberation with Aloy and Erend, but also through the perspective of Erend's sister Ursa.
And speaking of Mad Sun King Duran, what were the immediate and gradual effects to his reign ending?
Well, yeah, it's really the beginning of the Carja Civil War. So Avad is able to get rid of his father with the help of the Oseram, and Duran is killed, but a faction of the Carja escapes. And that's led by Helis and some other characters, and also it contains, that group contains Edaman, who is Avad's child half-brother. So it's them going to Sunfall that really starts the Civil War. And it's also a huge event for the Oseram because it involves a character named Derval, who who's very, very angry about how that went down without him. And this is something that's also covered in the comic book and in Horizon Zero Dawn. And it's also serves for us as the kickoff to a series of quests that you do with Erend, because the whole business with Derval becomes quite ugly and quite epic.
So the Liberation and its consequences are heavily featured in the main quest City of the Sun and Field of the Fallen. How did narrative and quests work together on bringing Liberation into the game?
Well, I think what's awesome about those quests, I mean, Tim and I worked quite a lot together on those quests. So it starts off as the Civil War really being the spark for it, because Erend is convinced that the Shadow Carja are responsible for killing his sister. And what happens pretty quickly in the first of those quests, Field of the Fallen, is that we have an investigation where Aloy figures that something else is kind of going on. And that investigation was something that Tim and I worked a lot on.
Yeah, it was kind of something that was in a bunch of the narrative summaries, and we knew we were going to have some kind of investigation mechanic. But it's those kind of sort of detective mechanics is something where quest and narrative needs to work really well together. Because if you're, I don't know, if quest places 10 things you need to examine, well, what happens if you examine them out of order? Are they all necessary? There's a lot of questions that we needed to answer. And yeah, I remember Ben doing lots of scribbles on pieces of paper of like, you've got to look at these things, but not this thing. And I think we eventually sorted it out. So it's actually incredibly simple behind the scenes, but it feels like this moment where you're actually unraveling what happened, which is kind of cool.
One thing I remember just bedeviling me in particular, but also us, was just that for every object that you can examine it just by kind of looking at it or kind of crouching down near it, but you also can scan it with your focus. And there'd be a different line for each one, but we couldn't tell which order the player would do that in. So you had to make the lines kind of like all work in that way. And that was fun.
Yeah. It's I think the second investigation in that quest was the much harder one. Because the first investigation, you're trying to set up a fake murder. And the second investigation, you're trying to set up a real murder, but body snatching fake murder as well, with like three clues or something.
But that moment was really big in the development of the game because that was the moment that we really figured out Aloy the detective. Because what's really awesome about that is like when the player plays it, there's no way they can understand exactly what all those clues add up to, right? Just by playing it. It's only Aloy that kind of clinches it at the end by doing this total Sherlock Holmes kind of maneuver where she puts together all the clues verbally for the player and also for Aaron in a way that really makes, wow, she's really smart. And she's like a little bit ahead of the player, but it also really makes the player feel really good because, yeah, I helped figure this out. And it worked really well. And it's also just kind of a cool moment for Aaron because that's when he realizes there's a chance that his sister might actually be alive.
I played that quest yesterday in preparation for this, and it got to the bit where Aloy's going to explain it all. And I'm like, oh, there's something broken here. Those leather things don't have anything to do with it. And she like lays it out. I'm like, oh my God, Ursa's still alive. I'd forgotten. It was really good.
Yeah.
The prison of Sunstone Rock has a role in the Civil War and liberation that most fans probably don't know about. Can you talk a little bit more about that backstory and quest?
Well, maybe you could sort of set up what the quest was like and what it was like to develop it.
Sure. So it was actually a quest that was pitched by Blake, one of our other senior designers, and he pitched it as this like whole hub town. I found the design document the other day, and he was like, you were going to do quests to earn reputation and you were going to be tracking down prisoners. But what it ended up as was you sort of turning up at this prison fortress in the middle of the jungle and discovering it under attack by two, well, I call them cargo rhinos, and I think I called them cargo rhinos earlier, but they're behemoths. So you just walk in on this fight, there are prisoners streaming past you, and then you sort of help them get their machine problem under control, and it turns into tracking down these three notorious villains.
So one of the things I really wound up liking about that quest are all the characters that you meet in the course of it. So there's some really good ones. First of all, the three fugitives are all pretty fun. My recollection is there's an Oseram who's sort of like an evil trap maker. There is the only Tanakh that we see in the whole game, which is a nice setup for Forbidden West. The Tanakh will be featured very heavily in that game. And there's also a Shadow Carja. Well, no, I'm sorry. I think he's a Carja smuggler who is smuggling weapons to the Shadow Carja. So he's in a sense a kind of traitor. So it fits in with the sort of Civil War in that way, but also in other ways. Because, and let's not forget, it also has a very memorable character in Geneva, who's the, did I just do the Dutch pronunciation? Geneva, who is the warden of Sunstone Rock. So that's a character I think we all liked. But there's a couple of other characters that are associated with Sunstone Rock, including Nil. So if you talk to Nil enough, you'll find out that he was actually imprisoned at Sunstone Rock at one point. And there's also a character, an important character actually, that was imprisoned at Sunstone Rock that we're going to learn a little bit more about in the future.
Oh, a tease. We love those. And, to end it, were there any quests that you were particularly proud of when, everyone played them?
I have to say for me, it's To Curse the Darkness because it's one that we completely rebuilt. And I had a lot of fun working with narrative and with Roland, our lead concept artist, like reimagining and rebuilding that quest. So that's kind of a personal one for me. It was just a work highlight, but I'm really proud of that one.
I'll go for a moment instead of a whole quest. It's something that just, I think, sort of turned out well. If you play, I believe it's the second quest in the quest line about Aaron and Ursa, you get to Derval's little workshop. And there's a number of little things you can investigate in that room that tell you more about Derval, about the Red Raids, and also about the Civil War. But in particular, there's a recording of Derval with his wife and child. And it's just a moment where that was recorded. So Derval's kind of like this tinker who actually he's really brilliant. He's actually built a recording device in the world of Horizon, which is no small feat. But also he's managed to record this memory, this conversation he had with his wife and daughter. And you hear the worry in the wife's voice about the Carja getting closer and closer to where they live. And this sense that things are going to kind of fall apart. And you actually hear Derval, who's like this complete villain, like reassuring his wife in this kind of gentle voice. And it's just one of those things where it kind of came together. I like the writing, but I also particularly liked the audio recording that we got and the voice recording. And it really kind of humanizes him. It sort of like sets up his entire motivation in one little moment. And it's just also, when you're talking about a civil war or a big conflict, it's just nice to get that little moment of like what life must have been like before that wave just kind of washed over everyone and really changed their lives.
So we're coming up to the end of this episode now. Thanks so much for joining us. The Carja Civil War has had lasting effects throughout the world we travel through as Aloy. So it's been really interesting to dive into this piece of history. What did you think about today's episode?
I had a lot of fun. I've been so buried in sort of Forbidden West that I haven't thought about a lot of the Carja stuff from Zero Dawn in a long time. And researching this and playing the quests again brought up a lot of good memories.
Yeah, same. I mean, I think one of the highlights for me on working on Zero Dawn was working with Tim and his team. I think there's a lot of great designers, and we had a lot of fun, and I actually learned a lot from them, but also about writing and working on all these quests. So it's great to kind of get to hang out with you and reminisce.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was super interesting, and especially talking a little bit more about Neil as well, learning more about him. Thank you both for joining today.
Let us know what you think on social media. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also let us know your thoughts via #HorizonGaiaCast. We'll be back with another episode before you know it, but until then, take care and we'll see you soon. Bye!